In the winter of 1943, on the frozen testing grounds of Nazi Germany, something was going terribly wrong, and no one wanted to admit it. Steel giants built to dominate Europe were failing without warning. Brand new Panzer tanks, fresh from the factory, were tearing up their own tracks, snapping suspension arms, and collapsing in the middle of maneuvers. Crews cursed the cold. Generals blamed sabotage. Engineers blamed materials. But the failures kept spreading, invisible and lethal, one breakdown at a time. 112 tanks would soon be crippled before ever reaching the front. And the cause was so small it seemed impossible. An angle, off by just 1.8 degrees. The machine that uncovered it was not led by a famous general or a decorated engineer, but by a single woman, quiet, uncelebrated, and surrounded by men who believed she had no place questioning their work. This is the story of how one ordinary woman, armed only with measurements, doubt, and stubborn courage, exposed a flaw the Third Reich could not afford to see, and how truth, once discovered, became more dangerous than any enemy weapon. Her name barely appears in surviving records, reduced to a line in technical reports. But in 1943, she was real, breathing, and afraid. She worked inside a German armaments inspection facility, a place that smelled of cutting oil, burnt steel, and cold ambition. The walls echoed with the rhythm of industry, hammers striking armor plates, engines screaming on test rigs, boots marching down concrete halls. She was not supposed to stand out. A woman in a male world assigned to quality verification, her job was to record numbers, stamp approvals, and keep quiet. Germany did not reward questions in wartime. It punished them, especially when they slowed production. But she had grown up around machines. She knew how metal was supposed to behave, how weight should settle, how symmetry mattered. And what she saw on those tanks felt wrong. The suspensions leaned just slightly under load. The tracks wore unevenly after only short runs. It was subtle, so subtle that experienced engineers waved it away as nothing. But she could hear it. A metal groan where there should have been balance. A vibration that shook through the hull and into her bones when the vehicle turned. At night, she lay awake in her small apartment, replaying the sound in her head, wondering if doubt alone could be considered treason. The pressure around her was suffocating. The Eastern Front was devouring tanks faster than factories could replace them. Every delay meant soldiers dying without armor. Every report of failure sparked rage from above. Inspectors were told, clearly and without mercy, that production targets mattered more than perfection. Good enough had become doctrine. Yet tank after tank returned damaged from testing grounds before ever seeing battle, and the excuses no longer matched the evidence. She began measuring again, quietly, carefully, checking alignment points others ignored. She noticed the factory jigs that set the suspension mounts had been modified weeks earlier to speed assembly. Faster welding. Faster output. But the jig was wrong. Almost laughably wrong. One support arm was tilted. Just a little. 1.8 degrees. An angle small enough to disappear on paper, but catastrophic under 40 tons of steel in motion. That tiny tilt shifted stress across the entire chassis. At speed, it amplified. On turns, it tore components apart. Tanks were not failing randomly. They were being born injured. Reporting this meant challenging senior engineers, men with medals and party protection. It meant accusing the system itself of error. She imagined the outcome. Dismissal at best, interrogation at worst. She was not a hero. She was cold, tired, and painfully aware of her fear. Yet she also imagined young crews sealed inside those steel coffins when the failure happened in combat, far from repair crews under enemy fire. Men screaming, trapped in machines that should have protected them. That thought burned hotter than fear. One night, she rewrote her inspection report. No vague language, no softened conclusions. She wrote the angle clearly. She attached diagrams. She signed her name. When the file left her hands, she knew her life might change forever, or end, because truth, in a system built on pressure and pride, is never welcomed quietly. The report did not explode like a bomb. It sank like a stone. Days passed, then weeks. The factory continued to roar, sparks raining across concrete floors, tanks rolling past inspection bays as if nothing had changed. She watched them go with a knot in her chest, wondering if her warning had already been buried under paperwork and politics. In Nazi Germany, silence was often the loudest answer. Then the summons came. Not dramatic, not threatening, just a short notice telling her to appear before a technical review board. 6 men would be waiting. She knew their names: senior engineers, party members, men whose careers were welded to the success of these factories. When she entered the room, it smelled of tobacco, ink, and impatience. Her report sat on the table, pages turned down at the corners as if already judged. They asked her to explain herself, calmly, quickly. Why had she delayed production with theoretical concerns? Why challenge equipment that had already been approved? As she spoke, she felt the weight of every uniform in the room pressing against her words. She described the angle, the jig, the stress transfer, the cascading failure under load. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply explained. They pushed back immediately. One engineer laughed, softly, confidently, and said a difference of 1.8 degrees could not destroy a tank. Another reminded her of deadlines, of men dying at the front, of her responsibility to the Reich. The unspoken threat hung in the air. Questioning authority in wartime was not bravery. It was disloyalty. Her hands trembled under the table, but she kept her eyes steady. Then she asked for something dangerous. A live test. One tank built with the existing jig. One corrected to perfect alignment. Run them hard. Load them fully. Turn them fast. Silence filled the room. Tests meant time. Time meant lost output. And if she was right, it meant admitting the system had failed, something the Third Reich rarely did. The board dismissed her. Officially, no decision. Unofficially, a warning. She returned to her station, knowing she had likely gone as far as she would be allowed to go. Then the breakdowns worsened. Not 1 or 2, but dozens. A training unit lost multiple vehicles in a single week. Another reported snapped suspension arms during routine maneuvers. Repair teams replaced parts that should never have failed. Whispers began moving through the factory, low and fast. Something is wrong. Something deeper than steel quality or weather. Eventually, practicality forced pride to step back. A quiet order came down to conduct limited tests. No announcements, no records meant for history, just results. She stood at the edge of the testing ground as the first tank ran. Dust, engine roar, the heavy clatter of tracks biting into frozen earth. Within hours, the symptoms appeared. Grinding, violent vibration, metal screaming under stress. Then the second tank rolled forward, the corrected one. It moved differently, smooth, stable, turning without tearing itself apart. The difference was undeniable. Men who had mocked her stared in silence as the truth unfolded in steel and noise. By the end of the trials, the number was no longer abstract. 112 tanks. That many vehicles already damaged or destroyed by a flaw no wider than a man's thumb on paper. For a moment she felt relief. Then it turned to dread. She had been right, and that made her dangerous. Corrections began immediately, quietly. Jigs were rebuilt. Procedures changed. No announcements. No acknowledgments. Officially, there had never been a mistake. Her name never appeared in commendations. But something changed inside her. She had stared down fear, hierarchy, and a system built to crush dissent, and she had not looked away. The tanks would keep rolling to the front, instruments of destruction in a brutal war. She could not change that. But she had learned a truth that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Even in the darkest machinery of history, the smallest voice, if it refuses to break, can force steel itself to bend. The factory settled back into its rhythm, but nothing felt the same. Corrected tanks now rolled through the yards, their suspensions holding firm. Their weight finally balanced the way metal intended. Failures decreased almost overnight. On paper, productivity had improved. In reality, disaster had only just been avoided. And yet, for her, safety did not arrive with success. It slipped further away. Engineers no longer laughed. They watched. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. There were no threats, no accusations, just distance. In wartime Germany, being right at the wrong moment could place a target on your back. She felt it in the way supervisors reread her reports, in the way party officials requested explanations that had already been given. Her discovery had not embarrassed a person. It had embarrassed a system. And systems remember wounds. She struggled with the weight of it at night. She had not acted to save the Reich or serve ideology. She had acted because machines are honest and people are not. Because an equation that fails on paper becomes a coffin in the field. But those reasons could not be spoken aloud. Even in private, fear had learned her voice. She began asking herself whether she had done enough, or too much, whether silence might have been safer. Around her, the war pressed closer. Allied bombers hummed high above at night, a distant mechanical thunder. Air raid sirens cut through sleep like knives. Broken tanks were no longer just statistics. They were reminders of how thin the margin was between life and disaster, between engineering and annihilation. Then something unexpected happened. Field reports returned, not of failures, but of reliability. Units noted that the newer tanks handled better in rough terrain, turned more smoothly, broke down less often during extended movement. No one referenced angles, no one cited her report, but the results spoke quietly where words could not. One workshop foreman, an older man with oil permanently embedded in his hands, simply nodded as a corrected tank passed inspection and muttered, "So that was it." It was the closest thing to recognition she would ever hear. She felt no triumph, only a strange, hollow responsibility. Her knowledge had extended the life of machines designed for killing. That truth followed her like a shadow. As the months passed, the scope of her discovery settled in. 112 tanks destroyed without enemy fire. Hundreds of hours wasted. Crews endangered before reaching battle. All of it traced back to a single decision made for speed, justified by pressure, never questioned because questioning was dangerous. She began to understand that history was not driven only by generals and battles, but by thousands of small choices made under stress, angles, tolerances, sacrifices of precision for pace. War magnified every error, and it punished honesty unless it could no longer be ignored. She remained at her post, measuring, checking, recording, knowing she could be replaced at any time, knowing also that if she stopped paying attention, the machines would not forgive anyone. In a world obsessed with power and obedience, she had discovered something quieter and more fragile: responsibility. Not to flags or orders, but to reality itself. By 1944, the war had begun to turn, and the factory felt it in ways numbers could not show. Materials grew thinner. Skilled workers vanished, sent to the front, killed in bombings, replaced by teenagers and forced laborers who learned machines through fear instead of training. Every shortage increased pressure on those who remained. Every delay brought closer scrutiny. And she understood now that the flaw she had exposed was not an exception. It was a symptom. Speed had become sacred. Precision had become optional. Mistakes no longer announced themselves with obvious failures. They hid, waiting for stress, for heat, for motion. She saw new shortcuts appear almost as soon as old ones were fixed. Welding passes reduced, inspections shortened, measurements skipped when supervisors looked away. The system was exhausting itself, eating its own margins to survive another month. She began documenting everything, not loudly, not heroically, but with a discipline bordering on obsession. Alignment, torque, heat treatment marks, anything that looked almost right but felt wrong. She knew the risk. Each note was a quiet act of defiance. And with every bomb that fell closer, the line between caution and catastrophe thinned. During one air raid, she was trapped inside the inspection hall as the ceiling shook and dust poured down like gray snow. A tank stood half-assembled beside her, its open hull echoing with every explosion. For the first time, she wondered if any correction mattered if the world itself was coming apart. But when the all-clear sounded and the work resumed, she returned to her measurements. Because collapse did not excuse carelessness. If anything, it demanded more honesty, not less. The atmosphere inside the plant shifted from arrogance to anxiety. Failures were no longer dismissed. They were feared. Supervisors asked questions they once mocked. Engineers double-checked calculations not because regulations demanded it, but because reality did. She was not celebrated, but she was quietly consulted. A diagram passed to her desk. A second opinion requested without official record. It was a dangerous kind of trust, built on necessity rather than respect. She felt the strain of it every day, knowing that one overlooked detail could undo everything she had already prevented, knowing also that speaking too clearly could revoke the fragile protection her competence provided. News from the front grew worse. Cities burned, lines collapsed. The tanks she helped keep running rolled into battles Germany would ultimately lose. There was no victory in that knowledge, only the understanding that engineering does not choose sides. It only obeys physics. Gravity does not honor ideology. Steel does not care who commands it. When it fails the same way for everyone. Late one evening, standing alone on the yard as damaged vehicles returned under their own power instead of tow cables, she felt something close to peace. Not pride, not relief. Simply the knowledge that truth, once confronted, had reduced suffering in the only way she knew how, by refusing to lie to reality. And in that refusal, however small, she had pushed back against a world built on denial.